everyone, and welcome to the Volunteer Technologist podcast. Here we take a look at the ways that people who are technically inclined volunteer outside of their primary job. Today I'm joined by Jesse Brennan, and he is going to talk to us about his work with the local fire department. Hello, Jesse.
Hey, how you doing, Gene? How's everything?
Pretty good. Wanted to
Good,
give you a
good.
chance to introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, awesome. So, my name is Jesse Brennan. I'm a lieutenant with the Penn Forest Volunteer Fire Company number 2, and also have largely been in tech for the last maybe 15 years or so in different engineering and project management roles.
Very cool. So I met you from us both working together previously, and during that time, you had told me about some custom electronics that you had built for your local fire department, and that it facilitated getting the firefighters some information they needed before leaving the station while they were still on Wi-Fi and before they got out into areas where they might not have such good service.
Yeah.
And that's about all I remember about it. But I remember it sounded really interesting, so I wanted to give you a chance to tell us about that and anything else you want to talk about in the same general field.
Yeah, absolutely. So to put this in a bit of context, just so everybody's aware, firefighting in the U.S. is largely volunteer dominated, right? So unless you're really in a big city, if you call 911 and you're looking for help from the fire department, it's very likely going to be volunteers that come out, right? And those volunteers are sitting at home, they might be at work, they might be at a restaurant or something like that. But we all effectively get pagers and we respond when we are around. So something like 85% of all fire departments in the United States are either volunteer or mostly volunteer. And in states like mine in Pennsylvania, that number actually grows to 97%. You typically don't see a career firefighter until you get into Philly or Pittsburgh in the state of Pennsylvania. So that creates some unique challenges where 911 is a 24/7 operation, right? Fires will always happen. And when they do, it's really urgent. So we typically use a suite of apps that really will give our officers and our chiefs some additional information on who's responding, where they're coming from. And we also have some apps that will connect to our computer-aided dispatch center, whether that be the county or the township that we're in, to give us more information on that call. And what that does is that allows us to really start formulating a plan earlier, and we start having an idea of who's going to be arriving for a particular call and the manpower that we're going to have to be working with, right? Some calls we have 40 guys, 40 people. Some calls might be a weird time. People are at work. We might have 10 and we need to make do with 10. But knowing that sooner rather than later helps us to really make that response appropriate. So within those apps, we all kind of will say whether or not we're responding, if we're going right to the scene, if we're going to station, if maybe we're picking up a certain apparatus or something. But then that starts having an issue with how do we start communicating that to everybody, right? Everybody's putting in information, but how do we pick up that information? When I get to the firehouse, I want to know who's coming and how do we communicate that in the easiest way possible. And typically fire departments will solve this by your typical firefighter isn't really a technical person, to be perfectly honest, right? So typically fire departments will solve this by they'll go to Best Buy, they'll get an off-the-shelf computer, throw it up on a TV or monitor somewhere, and it's off-the-shelf Windows that patches whenever it patches, that is usually at a login screen 3/4 of the time and not really showing the right data. So,
that login screen isn't all that helpful whenever you're trying to get in and get responded to a fire site. Oh, gee, what's the password for that again? So I can see why that's not exactly ideal.
Yeah, and when you're running into the firehouse, you want to know immediately who's coming, how far away are they, and what's the threshold for where I'm keeping this apparatus still before I go en route effectively, right? So if I can quickly see I have 3 people a quarter mile away, I know they're coming. I'm going to wait for them before that fire truck starts going somewhere. So I'm not showing up to a scene with a potentially empty fire truck and a bunch of firefighters that are sitting at station. So in my mind, and we're pretty solution oriented people, right? That's our day job. It's real hard to turn that off in the evening sometimes.
Yes, it is.
So So you look at that and you go, okay, well, how do I solve this problem? Because what was happening is we were getting dispatched to some pretty serious calls, whether they be motor vehicle accidents, or structure fires or wildfires that we typically have in our area. We get the station and somebody's got to log in. That takes up precious seconds, where maybe we're not giving the best response to the township and our responding area that we could be. So I took a sorry, go ahead.
Just to kind of pause right there for a second. I know, fortunately, most of us haven't experienced a house fire, but as a late teenager, I was a volunteer firefighter also. And my first thing about hearing about what you're talking about is it's amazing how even the standard baseline of tech has evolved in the last 20 years.
Yes.
Because whenever we still had pagers, which I think were almost identical to the ones that are being handed out today back then.
Yep.
But back in that time, virtually nobody had a cell phone.
Yeah.
Flip phones weren't even a thing yet. They were bricks. They were almost the size of the pagers that the firefighters carried. And so we had no idea who was coming. It's like when you get enough people to operate the truck, you left. And if nobody showed up, then sometimes you took the truck with one or two people on it. But the other thing I wanted to mention, just for context for people listening, is if you've ever started any kind of fire, it starts off a little slow and then all of a sudden it will just take off and go. And if you've ever seen how fast a fire can grow, that's where the seconds that Jesse was just mentioning come in so critical. The difference in arriving 1 to 2 minutes difference can be the difference of whether or not a house is savable or not.
Yes,
or
100%.
In a motor vehicle accident, the difference in whether somebody's bled out or not. And so this time you're talking about isn't just, as a geek, it's not just, oh, cool, I shaved off 30 seconds. Like, we're talking people's houses not burning all the way down, somebody surviving a car crash or a heart attack. So I just want to make sure we set the stage right for the people listening that we're geeks. We talked about a lot of tech, but this stuff matters at a whole lot deeper level. And that's part of why I'm so interested in it.
Yeah. And that kind of goes to fire departments aren't really a tech first operation a lot of the times, because by the time tech really gets into most fire departments, it needs to be proven. It needs to 100% absolutely be proven, which really dictates the type of tech that we're using. Because if we cannot 100% rely on it, then that could really cause some issues, right?
And I think that's why the pagers haven't changed all that much, because it is battle-proven tech that works in some of the worst conditions and worst signal areas you can imagine, but it still gets that signal out to the people who need it.
Oh yeah, 100%. So the pagers themselves, just to kind of give a little bit of insight into that tech, those are just simplex radio frequencies. Typically, they might be repeated on towers, but how a pager triggers for a particular fire department is 2 tones is sent over RF. It opens up the pager, and then the dispatcher gives the report and pretty much tells us where we're going. Just over standard RF, most people could buy an off-the-shelf scanner and actually hear what's going on with their local fire department, their local EMS, because that technology is so proven, and that's why we resisted going up to digital. Yeah, exactly. And not for nothing, we kind of break our radios a lot too. So when our radios cost $1,000, that's
it goes
not
back
great
to what you
either.
meant about firefighters aren't the most technical people. They're also not the easiest on electronics, or I don't know anything. I mean, stuff's got to be built to last around a fire department.
Oh yeah, and electronics as a whole doesn't like water and it doesn't like fire, and those are the 2 main things that we're really working with.
Ask your cell provider how much electronics like fire, or like fire and water. I think they have those clauses about water equals no warranty. So
Yep. There are no warranty claims in the fire department because we know we fried it by the time we're done using it. But that kind of goes to having that computer in the bay somewhere, right? Presenting that information. Even if that computer in a bay presenting that information does work most of the time, where we can tell who's coming, where responders are coming from, and how close they are to the department. Having a computer in a fire department bay is a pretty inherently hostile place. We do training there. Things are getting kicked. Things are getting battered around. I personally broken a lot of stuff in a bay just without having any intention to break anything, right? So that starts to so looking at that, I kind of thought, how do we get around this problem? How do we communicate effectively where ideally our officers and our apparatus operators, because those are the people that initially need to know that information first, know where people are, how far away they are, and can make the right decisions to make sure that we have the most effective response possible. And at least at our fire department, what we ended up doing was we started taking some LCD TVs. We suspended them about 6 feet up. So right away, it's a less hostile territory where things are getting kicked and ran into and possibly thrown, right? But how do we solve for that computer that's still laying on the floor too? And looking at it, a lot of these apps like I Am Responding and Active 911 and the applications that we're using, they're ultimately just a web kiosk, right? We can display all this information from a view perspective within a web page. And that's exactly what we did. So looking at it, I pretty much looked at it and said, I think I could solve this problem with a Raspberry Pi. So what we ended up doing was really just taking a Raspberry Pi, stripping out the entire OS to the point where it's just a very basic window manager, starts up Chromium just enough to display the web page, it auto logs in. So it's really just a mixture of scripts and settings and a couple of Chrome extensions to automate the moment you turn that Raspberry Pi on, it loads and it auto logs in and then tells you pretty much what the status of your fire department is, who's responding. And they stay on, 24/7. And that really kind of solves the problem. So what that has now allowed us to do, instead of going to Best Buy and spending $600 on a machine that's off the rack and doesn't really fit our use case to begin with, now we could take, I started with Raspberry Pi Zeros. They work, they're a little laggy. Eventually went to Raspberry Pi 3s for everything. But looking at the cost savings, now we can spend some of that money on additional screens. So what we end up with is pretty much every bay now has a screen where the apparatus operator can hop in, start the engine, start the truck, start our rescue, get that idling, but also start making determinations of where's my crew, how far away are they, what's my plan. We can also give a live view of the map of the scene. So when I say that, it's really just a quick like Google map. Here's where the scene is. Here's your approach. Not like
really cool.
like a live satellite view, but it kind of starts giving us some information because most towns have a couple main roads, and then you get most addresses can be hit 2 or 3 turns from a main road, right? So right away we're looking where in the town this is, rather than having to fuss around with Google Maps, see what's going on there. Like, how do we pull up directions real quick? We could just look and go, oh, it's a left on this and a right on that, and I'm right there.
That sounds
And
really
that's
nice.
really invaluable information for the apparatus operator. And Gene, to your point that you made, when you were a firefighter, I started in 2005 as well, and it was the same thing. Volunteer departments, we'd get a page, and then you just kind of hoped people were coming. There wasn't a whole lot more than that, to be perfectly honest. Everybody, firefighters in departments, they're a close-knit group. We all kind of know what each other are doing, where each other's at. If somebody's going away for a weekend, we have an understanding that, okay, so-and-so won't be here to take any calls this weekend. But for the most part, you were just kind of making sure, like, all right, I think I'm going to get 8 people.
Yeah.
And if you got between 6 and 10, great.
Yeah, no kidding. One thing that stood out to me from what you were just saying, too, is by switching to the kind of setup that you described with the Raspberry Pis, for the same amount of money, you've now got at least 6 times, or, well, counting screens, maybe 4.5 to 5 times as many, or got the information displayed 4.5 to 5 times as many places for the same amount of money. And so that in and of itself is huge. Plus, being that I think you said 85% of departments are volunteer, or 85% of firefighters are volunteer. You have to imagine that if the vast majority of firefighters are volunteers, that also means there's not a tremendous amount of extra funding. Because if there was a ton of funding, you'd probably have more professional firefighters. Well, when you don't have a ton of funding, being able to get this information up for 1/6 the cost, roughly.
Yeah.
$100 instead of $600 to $700. That's a pretty big deal, especially in a lot of departments that aren't in a city.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and I'm a little rural where I'm at, and looking at our budgets, right? We don't really get a whole lot from taxes. The nice part about living a little bit more rural is the taxes are cheaper, but at the end of the day, you kind of get what you pay for, right? There's
Yeah.
a lot less of that pie to go around. So in our volunteer department, we have to make up that funding shortfall in other ways, right? So that might be something called boot drives, or you kind of stand in the road, and I'm sure everybody's ran across it
Yep.
if you've been outside of a city on Memorial Day weekend or July 4th weekend or something, where the local fire department's pretty much standing in the road with a boot begging for donations or some sort of pancake breakfast or some other way. We are pretty lucky. We are pretty well funded considering the area that we are in, just due to some of the fundraising activities that we do. But it's absolutely a cost saving exercise, right? When you look at it, the off the shelf, and I see this in departments all the time, because this is a pretty common app that a lot of departments use, especially if you're volunteer, because you know where people are coming from, right? It's not really a consideration of everybody's career because they're all there. But typically that use case has been buy a computer, buy a TV, hook it all up, and unfortunately, Windows updates takes over, and 3 a.m. you're typing in a password because it rebooted, because nobody knows how to correctly configure a Windows machine in kiosk mode. And when you do, sometimes an update will revert some changes there. So looking at what we did and rolling it out across our fire department, we definitely, and the size of a fire department too, right? So we have a 6-bay fire department. To have one system that contains all that information to look at real quick before you hop on an apparatus isn't the most effective thing. You're not, you're kind of running around in the opposite direction that you need to be going at a certain point.
Yeah,
So
you
so to
said
have it
sometimes
right
you
on
have
the
as
bay
many as
doors.
40. You said you had sometimes have as many as 40 people responding to a given fire. I can't
Yes.
imagine 40 people trying to stand around one display to figure out what the heck's going on. I mean, if you've ever
Exactly.
done that in a restaurant, trying to all see the same menu sign, or at an airport, all trying to see the same flight arrival board, you know
Yeah.
exactly how ineffective that is. So, yeah, that totally makes sense, and not something I had thought about until you said it.
Yeah, and having 40 people in a volunteer fire department is a good problem to have, but it does
Oh,
cause
yes,
some
yes.
scaling issues sometimes. But yeah, no, that's exactly it. Because one of the benefits of these dashboards too is they plug into our local dispatch centers. So we are now getting more context on the calls. We might have an initial dispatch of 2-car MBA, 2 injuries, but reading these screens, especially while you're letting apparatus kind of warm up, they're really big diesel engines. Are most of our larger apparatus, I believe, is between 500 and 675 horsepower. That we don't want to, the nature is you start it up and you go, and that does a lot of damage to engines over time. So if we can
Yeah.
spend a couple minutes idling and waiting for people, that also helps us money wise to not put too much wear and tear on our engines. So if we can sit there idle, have the apparatus operator be in the driver's seat, but also read a screen in front of him or her where it says, yeah, it's a 2-car MVA, but one person has head injuries, one person might have a sprained wrist. That changes the picture a little bit, because now we just have one really critical injury that we need to worry about. But that's not necessarily something that gets communicated over the radios.
Yeah. Yeah. I know in the area I live in, it's really common for there to be a single paid professional at each
Mm-hmm.
station or
Yep.
in each general area, and then everybody else is a volunteer.
Yep.
And frequently that paid professional, they've got a full-time gas vehicle as opposed to the big diesel trucks. But they've
Yep.
got a full-time gas vehicle, and they will respond initially and do some of that scene assessment. And then
Yep.
I'm assuming let the people back at the station have a little more information, or let dispatch know what's going on. But it sounds like this would help make sure that gets down to the volunteers who aren't necessarily going to be on the radios. They just have their pagers, or at least for a while will only have pagers. So much
Yep.
sounds like a much better way of communicating a lot of that info to the people who really need to know it.
It is, right, and there's a lot of times that the initial hustle of somebody calling 911, they're in a panic, they might be communicating the wrong things, and a lot of departments have it to where a senior officer will go right to the scene, at the very least, to validate the call. right?
Yeah.
They know responding units are coming in, but let me get there first. Let me start formulating a plan. If you have a chief that goes to the scene, while we're all at the fire department going, you hop on this apparatus, we'll hop on this apparatus. This is what we need to bring to the scene for a response. That senior officer is looking at a potential, structure that's on fire and going, okay, what's my first attack path when things start getting here? And at that point, you're starting to put a plan together in parallel, right? That the last thing you want to do is show up to a scene and go, okay, now what?
Yeah.
Because that's also not that's not great some of the times. But at the very
Right.
least, they're validating some of those dispatch notes that we might be seeing and starting to formulate a plan in the back of an engine on the way to a call that
That's
we
really
might have
cool.
seen on our screens. Yep. Yeah, and then on top of that too, some of these applications, we have iPads in our vehicles where we can actually put ourselves en route and it will follow our GPS. So,
Oh, nice.
if we do have a chief or a senior officer at a scene, they now know where the closest engine is. Are they 5 minutes away? Are they 10 minutes away? Because that might dictate what the plan's going to be
Yeah.
when they get there.
I
So
imagine.
yeah.
I was going to say, I imagine that could also bring into bear whether or not they need to maybe upgrade the call to like a mutual aid call or something like, okay, I don't have enough people
Exactly.
from my station coming. Do I need to get another station en route also because we just don't have enough people to deal with this thing I'm looking at?
Yeah, exactly, and that's what essentially these apps really kind of afford us, and just the way that we're showing the information both at the station and on scene as well, where we're communicating now in a whole nother way to where there's a lot more telemetry and data on who's responding, where they're responding from, and what you're getting to be able to make those choices sooner.
That's
And what
really
that,
awesome.
yeah,
And
yeah, and
just
that
bring
translates
things back
into,
home. Yeah, I think you're about to
yeah,
say it, but that translates into how fast whatever the problem is can be resolved and
yep,
how
one
well
hundred
it can be
percent.
resolved. And that's when you're talking about people's livelihoods, their homes, their lives, that's huge.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so putting these screens together really helped us out. So what I ended up doing was I ended up throwing all my shell scripts and things on GitHub to see if there are other departments that could make use of this code, right? This is now a solved problem. I know maybe not the most, not every department has, somebody who might be an engineering or might be an engineer in the technology space, but they know how to configure a Raspberry Pi, right? So I put a set of instructions together that pretty much was on the baseline of, if you can figure out how to load an OS onto a Raspberry Pi, you could build your own system here. And what I started seeing is that departments across the country started kind of interacting with this GitHub either just via questions or stars and forks. Some really advanced people would actually fork the code, put their own department's logo on the boot screen, which I thought was really, really cool, and kind of make it their own.
Yeah, that really is
But
cool.
yeah, but now we have, a solved problem that we could now start deploying at multiple departments, because I can't tell you how many departments I walk into and there's a computer somewhere on the bay floor, usually at a Windows OS boot screen, that needs to be logged in before you actually start getting any functional information from some of these apps that we use.
That's incredible. And I think I'm really glad to hear that you've put it out there, and we'll be sure and put links to what you were just describing in the show notes for this episode so that anybody listening can take a look at it and either share it around with people they know, or if they happen to also be in the fire service, maybe they can take advantage of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a couple of Raspberry Pis and a little bit of code in Raspbian, and you're off to the races.
That's really cool. One question I did have is, how did you get into all this?
Yeah, so I grew up around this a little bit. My father worked for a township DPW in New Jersey, where they were right next to the local EMS department. So they were a volunteer EMS department. They pretty much ran. They did the same thing that we do in the fire service, just with EMS calls, right? Emergency medical services, where it was a volunteer ambulance company that would go out and solve medical issues. So growing up in New Jersey and living in New Jersey when I turned 18, knowing that world, I pretty much just walked into my local fire department and asked for an application. Just wandered in on a drill night and just asked for an application, and From there, the rest is history. Just they all kind of took me under their wing. It's joining a fire department. It's a really good group of people at every fire department. They're committed to community service, but also you end up making a lot of friends, right? So if this is something that if you see firefighters and go, I'd be interested in doing that, chances are you live in an area with a volunteer department and you could totally get involved somehow. Not every volunteer fire department means you need to be walking into structures that are on fire. Sometimes they could use drivers, sometimes they could use helpers, but it's a really good cohesive group of people, and you end up making friendships for life there because you end up getting pretty close to one another just based on the shared experience. And then also in Jersey, I ended up joining a EMS squad, same thing. So was an EMT for a little while and did the same thing just in another organization.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of jobs around the fire service that don't require going into the buildings.
Yeah.
Everything from being on a hose outside to pulling the hoses to
Yep.
One of the more skilled jobs is being the pump operators and the engineers that are actually operating the trucks or the apparatus outside. I mean, those jobs are actually, in a lot of cases, are a much more skilled job than holding the hose and going into the building and some of the other stuff, just because you've got to know a lot, including some things
100%.
about fluid dynamics and pump operation and
Yep.
on the fly pump repair because all of a sudden the pump's not working right and like all kinds of stuff. But it's also a incredibly rewarding thing, or at least it was whenever I was younger and was both willing and able to do that. And from what you've described, I have to imagine you feel that it's incredibly rewarding too.
It is, and honestly, being in tech, we get a lot of exposure to the same type of problem solving aspects, right? So there's a lot of shared kind of problem solving aspects of you got to do what you got to do, but it makes you more well rounded in terms of being mechanically aware of things, right? Because everything in the fire services is pumps and water flow management and different mechanical type things that you're doing.
Yeah.
And as an engineer who pretty much sits in front of a keyboard all day, it's a welcome contrast, to be perfectly honest.
Oh, I bet.
But it also makes you better, well-rounded, and it starts opening up new perspectives into how not only are you solving problems in the fire service coming from the IT space, but on the other way of, okay, now you're more mechanically aware. How do I solve this certain problem that maybe my colleagues haven't considered because they're not typically mechanical type people. They might be locked in a certain thought process where now you have exposure to several different types of problem solving methodologies that aren't typically represented within your industry.
Yeah, it's amazing how your professional life can make you better in your volunteer life, and your volunteer life can actually make you better in your professional life. It's a two-way street of improvement.
Yeah, exactly. And it also gives perspectives to urgent issues in your job too, right? Like now I'm that calming person on a Sev 1 because my thought process is if nobody's dying, then we're doing okay. Yeah. Let's figure this out.
No need for the adrenaline to get going. The house isn't burning down. A car hasn't run into something.
Exactly. Okay. We have a service down. It's pretty important. I completely understand that, but let's calmly, start troubleshooting this rather than really just potentially doing something where you're taking shortcuts and potentially causing a bigger issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it kind of gives you that rapport on those bridges where you are the calming voice to say, okay, let's figure this out. Because it definitely gives you that level of perspective.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for what you're doing for both your fire department and for putting it out there for other fire departments. It's really awesome. Wanted to give you a moment if you wanted to tell people how they could reach out to you if they have any follow-ups or if there's just anything else you wanted to share with the audience.
Yeah. If there's any questions at all, please feel free to send me an email, me at jesse-brennan.com. And I'm sure my name's going to be in the show notes. And
absolutely.
Yeah. The only other parting words that I would probably say is fire departments in the U.S. are very accessible buildings. If you're interested at all, even if you just want to take a tour, one of the pleasures of every firefighter is showing off all the equipment. So don't hesitate if you're interested at all. Just reach out to your local firehouse and say, hey, can I see what tools you have and what trucks you're running, and they'll gladly bring you through and show you everything. And that's one of the pleasures of being a firefighter is showing the community our cool toys, really.
And I will tack on to that from what I have gathered, I don't think there's a firehouse around that is sad when the parent brings around a small kid who is fascinated by the fire vehicles. Because they see him on TV or they see him in the cartoons or even in the books.
Yep.
And then to see him in person, the way a kid's face lights up when they get to see a fire truck up close is just phenomenal. And I say that because I got to take my kid to see a fire truck that was at a event we went to. It was a event with fireworks and stuff like that. So they had the local fire service on scene. But of course, they're just parked there killing time, hoping they don't have any reason to do anything. And so they were perfectly happy to have kids come around and look. But I know the station houses are generally that way too.
Yep, 100%. As long as there's somebody there, they will show you around. You might, especially with volunteer departments, they're not typically staffed 24/7. Although we will take calls 24/7. So you might have to wait till a drill night or something. But I can't tell you how often we've had families come or a parent with a few kids come on a drill night where there's 20 of us there. And we're all fighting to show the apparatus off, right? No, I'll give them the tour. It's fine.
That's really awesome. Thank you again for your time and for sharing your story. And I really do appreciate it.
Same here.
Have a wonderful day.
You as well. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Volunteer Technologist podcast. This is a value for value podcast, which means I'll never charge you to listen. That said, producing and hosting it does cost money. If you got value from today's show, then I hope you'll consider contributing to its ongoing production by sending a boost with a new podcast app such as Fountain, or via the Buy Me a Coffee link on volunteertechnologist.com/contribute. You can find show notes, transcripts, and links to the things talked about in today's episode at volunteertechnologist.com. Thanks for listening.